World War II soldiers depended on more than weapons to function in the field. For U.S. Army troops, survival relied on standardized food, clothing, medical supplies, tools, and basic living equipment delivered through a vast logistical system. This video breaks down the essential items U.S. soldiers used to live and operate in the field during World War II. Section 1. Food and Rations. K-Ration. The K-Ration was designed as a lightweight individual meal intended for short-term use. It was issued primarily to soldiers operating in mobile units such as infantry patrols, paratroopers, and armored crews. A typical K-Ration package contained biscuits, canned meat or cheese, sugar, chewing gum, and a powdered beverage. The ration was compact and easy to carry, making it suitable for movement, but it was never intended for long-term consumption due to limited calories and nutrients. C-Ration. The C-Ration became the primary combat ration for U.S. forces. It consisted of canned meat-based meals paired with biscuits and accessory items such as coffee and sugar. C-Rations were heavier than K-Rations, but provided more sustenance for sustained operations. Because they required no cooking, they could be eaten cold, which made them reliable under combat conditions. However, the weight and repetitive nature of C-Rations often affected morale during prolonged use. D-Ration. The D-Ration was an emergency chocolate bar designed to provide high calories in a compact form. It was intentionally formulated to be hard and unappetizing to discourage casual consumption. Soldiers were instructed to reserve the D-Ration for extreme situations when other food sources were unavailable. Its purpose was survival rather than comfort. 10-in-1 ration. The 10-in-1 ration was designed to feed a small group of soldiers. It included a variety of canned foods and accessory items packaged together in a wooden crate. This ration allowed units to prepare more substantial meals when time and conditions permitted. It also reduced the monotony associated with individual rations. Accessory items. Accessory items played a supporting but essential role in field rations. Coffee, sugar, chewing gum, and matches helped soldiers maintain routine and alertness. While small in size, these items significantly influenced daily functioning and morale. Hydration. Water was an inseparable part of any ration system. Each soldier carried a canteen, and refilling it was a constant priority. Access to safe drinking water varied widely depending on terrain, weather, and supply conditions. In many cases, hydration was a greater logistical challenge than food itself. Reality of eating in the field meals were rarely eaten in ideal conditions. Food was often consumed quickly, cold, and under physical stress. Despite the industrial scale of U.S. logistics, shortages and interruptions were common during rapid advances, retreats, or environmental extremes. Section 2. Clothing and Personal Gear. Field Uniform. The standard U.S. Army field uniform consisted of multiple layers intended for adaptability rather than comfort. These garments were worn continuously for extended periods, often without regular washing or replacement. Uniforms had to endure mud, rain, friction from equipment, and exposure to the elements. As a result, wear and tear were expected, and repairs were commonly done in the field when replacements were unavailable. Layering system. Rather than relying on a single heavy garment, U.S. soldiers used a layered clothing approach. This allowed adjustments based on weather, activity level, and availability of additional gear. Layers could be added or removed depending on conditions, but supply shortages often meant soldiers had to make do with what they already carried. Cold weather clothing. In colder climates, additional items such as wool shirts, heavy jackets, gloves, and insulated trousers were issued. Cold weather boots were designed to provide warmth, but they were not always sufficient for extreme conditions. Distribution of winter gear was uneven, particularly during rapid deployments or unexpected seasonal changes. Inadequate cold weather clothing contributed significantly to non-combat injuries. Headgear and helmets. The M1 steel helmet was standard issue for U.S. soldiers. Its primary function was protection against shrapnel and debris, rather than direct ballistic impact. Helmet liners allowed for limited comfort and adaptability. Netting and covers were often added to reduce glare or provide basic camouflage. Load-bearing equipment. Personal gear had to be carried at all times. Belts, suspenders, pouches, and packs distributed the weight of ammunition, food, tools, and personal items. Improper load balance increased fatigue and reduced mobility. Overloaded soldiers faced slower movement and greater physical strain during long marches. Footwear combat boots were designed for durability and mass production. While sturdy, they were often stiff and required time to break in. Wet conditions, mud, and long-distance movement contributed to foot injuries. Foot care became an essential part of daily routine, especially during extended operations. Personal items. Beyond issued gear, soldiers carried small personal items such as letters, photographs, and basic hygiene supplies. These items occupied minimal space, but played an important role in maintaining routine and psychological stability. Clothing and personal gear formed the physical interface between the soldier and the environment. Their effectiveness directly influenced endurance, mobility, and overall health. Section 3. Medical and First Aid. Individual First Aid Packet. Every U.S. soldier carried an individual first aid packet as part of standard equipment. This packet typically contained a bandage designed to control bleeding until medical assistance became available. The first aid packet was intended for self-use or for aid from nearby soldiers. Its purpose was immediate stabilization rather than full treatment. Field dressings and bandages. Field dressings were designed to be simple, durable, and easy to apply under stress. They could be used quickly, often in poor visibility or under fire. Because supplies were limited, bandages were sometimes reused or supplemented with improvised materials when shortages occurred. Medics and medical kits. Combat medics operated close to the front lines. They carried medical bags containing bandages, disinfectants, morphine syringes, and basic surgical tools. Medics focused on stopping bleeding, reducing shock, and preparing casualties for evacuation. Their equipment was limited, and survival often depended on how quickly treatment could be delivered. Morphine and pain management. Morphine was commonly used to manage severe pain and shock. It was administered carefully, often using pre-measured syringes designed for rapid use in the field. Pain management was essential not only for comfort, but also to stabilize wounded soldiers during transport. Evacuation and casualty collection. Medical care extended beyond immediate treatment. Wounded soldiers were moved through a chain of care, beginning with frontline aid and progressing to rear medical facilities. Evacuation relied on stretchers, vehicles, and coordination between units. Delays caused by terrain, weather, or combat conditions often increased mortality. Field hospitals. Field hospitals were established behind the front lines to provide surgery and extended care. Conditions were often crowded and improvised, with limited sanitation and supplies. Medical personnel worked under constant pressure to treat large numbers of casualties in short periods of time. Disease and non-combat injuries. Not all medical issues came from combat wounds. Disease, infections, and exposure-related injuries affected large numbers of soldiers. Poor hygiene, contaminated water, and prolonged exposure to cold or heat contributed significantly to illness and reduced combat effectiveness. Preventive medical measures. Preventive care was an important part of military medicine. Vaccinations, sanitation measures, and basic hygiene practices were enforced when possible. These measures reduced the spread of disease and helped maintain unit strength over long campaigns. Medical and first aid systems formed the invisible backbone of the U.S. Army's ability to sustain combat operations. Without them, even minor injuries could become fatal, and manpower losses would quickly overwhelm frontline units. Section 4. Tools and Daily Equipment. Entrenching Tool. The entrenching tool was one of the most essential items carried by U.S. soldiers. It was used to dig foxholes, trenches, and shallow shelters that provided protection from enemy fire and the environment. Digging was a routine task rather than an emergency measure. In many situations, soldiers were expected to establish defensive positions immediately upon stopping, regardless of fatigue or weather. Mess kit. The mess kit allowed soldiers to eat and, when possible, heat food. It typically consisted of simple metal containers that could be stacked and carried easily. Mess kits were designed to serve multiple purposes, including holding rations, boiling water, or warming canned food. Their usefulness depended heavily on access to heat and time, both of which were often limited. Utility knives and cutting tools. Knives were among the most versatile tools carried by soldiers. They were used for food preparation, equipment repair, cutting materials, and general utility tasks. Because supply replacements were not always available, soldiers often relied on the same knife for extended periods, maintaining it as best they could. Navigation equipment, maps and compasses were critical for movement and coordination. Accurate navigation affected whether units reached objectives, avoided hazards, or became disoriented. Maps were frequently updated, but conditions on the ground often changed faster than documentation. As a result, navigation required constant judgment rather than strict adherence to plans. Communication equipment. Communication tools connected soldiers to their units and command structures. Radios, field telephones, and signal devices allowed coordination across distances. Reliability varied depending on terrain, weather, and equipment condition. When communication failed, messages were carried by runners or relayed through visual signals. Maintenance and repair tools. Soldiers were expected to maintain their equipment. Small repair tools were used to fix straps, packs, footwear, and weapons-related gear. Improvised repairs were common, as formal maintenance facilities were not always accessible. Keeping equipment functional often depended on individual initiative rather than official support. Lighting and signal items. Flashlights, signal flares, and other lighting devices were used sparingly. Light discipline was critical, especially at night, to avoid detection. These tools were essential for navigation, communication, and emergency signaling despite their limited availability. Carrying and storage equipment. Pouches, bags, and containers organized daily necessities. Efficient storage reduced movement time and prevented loss of critical items. Poor organization increased fatigue and slowed response during combat or movement. Tools and daily equipment formed the practical foundation of a U.S. soldier's routine. They enabled construction, movement, communication, and self-sufficiency under constant pressure. While often overlooked, these items played a decisive role in whether soldiers could operate effectively from one day to the next. Section 5. Sleeping and living conditions. Sleeping gear, U.S. Soldiers were issued basic sleeping equipment such as blankets, sleeping bags, or ponchos. These items provided minimal insulation and were often shared, layered, or combined depending on conditions. Sleeping gear was designed to be lightweight and portable rather than comfortable. Protection from cold and moisture was limited, especially during prolonged operations. Ground sleeping. Most soldiers slept on the ground whenever operations allowed. This could be inside a foxhole, trench, or shallow dugout, created with entrenching tools. Ground conditions varied widely. Mud, snow, uneven terrain, and standing water were common challenges that affected rest and health. Shelters. Temporary shelters included tents, tarps, dugouts, and improvised coverings made from ponchos or local materials. Shelters were designed to provide concealment and basic protection from weather rather than long-term habitation. In urban or semi-urban areas, abandoned buildings were sometimes used. These offered better cover but also introduced risks such as structural instability or enemy observation. Rest under operational conditions. Sleep was rarely continuous. Soldiers rested in short intervals dictated by guard duty, movement orders, or combat activity. Noise, light discipline, and environmental exposure further limited rest quality. Fatigue accumulated over time and affected performance even when no combat occurred. Hygiene and living conditions. Maintaining hygiene was difficult under field conditions. Limited access to water and supplies meant bathing and laundry were infrequent. Poor hygiene contributed to illness, infections, and discomfort. Foot care in particular was critical due to constant movement and exposure to wet conditions. Living with equipment. Soldiers lived surrounded by their equipment. Weapons, packs, and tools were kept within reach at all times, even while resting. This constant readiness reduced response time, but limited relaxation and recovery. Personal space was minimal, and privacy was virtually non-existent. Weather exposure. Weather shaped every aspect of living conditions. Rain, cold, heat, and wind affected where and how soldiers slept. Protective measures reduced exposure but could not eliminate it. Long-term exposure to harsh environments caused physical exhaustion and increased medical issues. Sleeping and living conditions defined the rhythm of a soldier's daily existence. Rest was inconsistent, comfort was minimal, and survival depended on adaptation rather than preparation. Section 6. Weather and environmental survival. Rain and wet conditions. Rain was one of the most persistent challenges in the field. Wet clothing, soaked equipment, and muddy terrain reduced mobility and increased fatigue. Ponchos and rain gear provided limited protection. Once clothing became wet, drying, it was difficult due to constant movement and lack of shelter. Prolonged exposure to moisture contributed to illness, skin infections, and foot problems. Managing dryness became a daily concern rather than an occasional inconvenience. Cold environments. Cold weather posed serious risks, particularly during winter operations. Insufficient insulation, frozen ground, and limited shelter increased the likelihood of frostbite and hypothermia. Even when cold weather gear was issued, effectiveness depended on proper use and availability. In many cases, soldiers relied on layering, movement, and shared warmth to maintain body temperature. Cold also affected equipment. Metal tools became difficult to handle, and mechanical reliability decreased in extreme temperatures. Heat and sun exposure. Hot environments created a different set of challenges. Extended exposure to sun and heat increased dehydration and exhaustion. Water consumption increased dramatically, placing additional strain on supply systems. Protective measures such as rest periods and shade were not always possible during operations. Heat-related illnesses reduced effectiveness and required medical attention even in the absence of combat. Terrain and ground conditions. Terrain influenced movement, shelter, and supply delivery. Mud, sand, snow, and uneven ground slowed progress and increased physical strain. Poor ground conditions complicated digging, vehicle movement, and evacuation of wounded personnel. In many cases, the environment posed as much difficulty as the enemy. Insects and wildlife. Insects were a constant presence in many theaters of war. Bites, infections, and disease transmission affected large numbers of soldiers. Preventive measures such as repellents and netting were used when available, but coverage was inconsistent. Living conditions often made avoidance impossible. Adaptation and routine. Over time, soldiers adapted to their environments through routine and experience. Clothing was adjusted, equipment modified, and daily habits changed to match local conditions. Environmental survival depended less on comfort and more on consistency. Small adjustments made daily life more manageable over long campaigns. For U.S. soldiers in World War II, daily life in the field was shaped by logistics rather than comfort. Food, clothing, medical care, and basic equipment determined whether units could function and survive. In future videos, we'll break down these systems in greater detail, focusing on individual categories of soldier life in World War II.